let's take a look at some formatting tips. This is an often overlooked part of other Excel courses. I included it here in our course because good presentation is crucial, especially if you're presenting to top management and want to both impress them and make it easy for them to review your work. I personally have a background in both accounting and finance. I began my career in financial statement audit and learned very early that it was important to show your work in a way in which each of the steps that you took to perform a task were traceable so that your manager or audit partner could flip through your work with ease. As you can see here in our workbook, there are 19 formatting tips that I'm going to show you in this lesson. And by the way, how do you like the way this workbook is formatted? I wanted to create something that was easy to follow, easy to read, easy on the eyes, especially since I'm teaching fellow professionals, colleagues, and students. Now I could have made it look very bare and simplistic, but with the exact same content and material, like this. But that doesn't look very good, does it? No, instead it looks cheap, it's hard to follow, and I don't know where to look. It doesn't point the user in a certain direction, and it doesn't look professional. So let's undo that. The first formatting tip that I wanted to show you, which we actually just did, is hiding and unhiding grid lines. When I first opened up a full workbook that didn't have grid lines, I thought that the person who created it just went to the format painter and had painted everything white. But that's not the proper way to do things, and it takes too long. You'll end up spending hours painting the whole workbook and miss areas if you try to paint white cells everywhere. Instead, there's an easier way. Just go to View and uncheck Grid Lines. Now let's move on to the Format Painter. There's this awesome tool in the top ribbon of Excel that allows you to copy the format of a cell and then paste it in a different cell. That's called the Format Painter, and it looks like the paintbrush. It's up in the top ribbon and near the home button where the home button's placed. Let's give it a try in cell F9. I'm going to click on cell E9, and let's assume that I want to paint F9 with the same text, color, and format of cell E9. All that I need to do is to click on the cell that I want to copy from, in this case cell E9, then click on the paintbrush in the top ribbon, and then click on the cell F9, and then it will update its format. This is definitely a formatting tool that I often use in workbooks, because if there's a particular font style, font size, color, etc. that you want to mimic in a different cell or set of cells, then it's just easier to copy the format of it and then paste it with that other format using the Format Painter, rather than changing all the text characteristics manually. The great thing about the Format Painter is that you can paint over a large area, and you don't just need to do one cell at a time. Similarly, what if you want to clear the format of a particular set of cells? Sometimes you open up a workbook and it's just a mess with a ton of different formats. Well, to get rid of formats and cleanse the sheet, all you need to do is to click on the Home button in the top ribbon, navigate to the Clear button on the right side, and then click the Clear Formats button. The next formatting tip that is famous is the if-error formula. Now, this is definitely one that I use often. I often use it when I'm using formulas like VLOOKUP, because if the VLOOKUP formula doesn't return a result by finding the item you're searching for, then it will return the values NA, which look bad, and it's also a distraction. Therefore, by wrapping the formula with an if-error formula, you can advise your formula to return something cleaner, looking like a 0 or a blank. In the example shown on screen here, we're actually calculating the growth rate of revenue year over year. However, the denominator, year 2018, is nil because it was the first year of operations in 2019, and therefore, if we divide a number by 0, it will result in an error. In this case, we can use the if-error formula to show a 0 instead of NA, or we can just show blanks. You can see we did both of these examples in this worksheet. The next formatting tip that I want to talk about is the apostrophe symbol. There are a couple of purposes of using this. First, let's say you're making a list to show in Excel, but you want to use the hyphen symbol at the start of a cell. If you try to do that normally, Excel is going to think that you're trying to subtract something if you put the minus sign at the beginning as a bullet. However, instead, if you put an apostrophe first and then the hyphen / minus sign, you'll succeed and be able to create your list. Additionally, the apostrophe is useful when there are digits in your cells, and the first digit is a 0. This can be the case, which is pretty common actually in the US for zip codes. Normally, Excel will hide a 0 if it appears as the first digit. However, if you put the apostrophe first and then the 0 will then stay, and the apostrophe doesn't even appear. You can see that's the case here in cell E19. If I remove the apostrophe, you'll see the 0 disappear, which may not be ideal if you want to keep the 0. For instance, in the case of showing zip codes with a 0 at the beginning. The next formatting tip is regarding freeze panes. Freeze panes can be helpful when you're trying to lock a certain part of a screen while you want to scroll through the worksheet. Let's say, for instance, you want to scroll down through this worksheet, but keep the visibility of the headers here, which show the number, shortcut, purpose, and example. To freeze the panes, click on the cell directly below where you'd like to freeze the pane, then go to View, then click on Freeze Panes. Note that this is also going to lock the column where the numbers are shown so that I can scroll to the right and still have visibility on the numbers. If you want to lock the row, we could remove the freeze pane and do it again, but by selecting the first column where we want to do it so that the freeze pane only applies to the row above it. Let's move on to something different. Let's move on to formatting tips. Formatting tip 7. In this tip, I want to remind you that it's important to be consistent with the date format that you choose in Excel workbook. This is a personal pet peeve of mine because you don't want to set multiple characteristics for the same type of date or text within a workbook. It just doesn't look clean, and it gets the reader or the user of the workbook guessing. It can be misleading to have multiple dates shown in a variety of ways, especially since a 01 can be denoted as either a day or a month. Obviously, if it was a 13, you'd know that it couldn't be a month because obviously there's only 12 months in a year. For example, let's take a look at the date formats shown here on screen. In row 22, I'm showing the good and proper version of presenting dates in a consistent format, and in the row directly underneath it, I'm showing inconsistent date formats. So it's always good practice to use one date format, throw it a workbook, and stick to it. Formatting tip 9 is all about locking cells. This is one of the most useful tips in Excel and extremely important as a formatting shortcut in Microsoft Excel. By placing the $ in front of a letter or number, you can lock it so that when you copy that cell to another location in the workbook, it will be fixed on the part that you locked. For instance, in the first example here, we have locked both F and 91 by placing a $ in front of each. To do that quickly, all you need to do is go into the cell using the F2 button and then press the F4 button once. Let's try that in cell E25. So we just go into the cell and click F4 to lock the letter and the number. Then, if we hit F4 a second time, it locks the row. Pressing F4 a third time locks the column only. If you try to copy the first cell over the cell next to it, for example F25, the formula will not change because the references are locked. In the second example, if we copy the cell to the right of it, then only the column changes, but not the row, because the row was locked. In the third example, when we copy it to the right, the column does not change because it's locked. The row does not change because we are copying the cell over to the right, but if we copied it down, it would change the row to 102 because 101 is not locked. Let's look at another example. Assume we want to apply a 5% growth rate to forecast periods starting February 2019 to both revenues and expenses. In cell E33, all we need to do is write a formula that takes the January 31st revenue and multiplies it by 1 plus 5%. For instance, 1 plus cell reference D30 will achieve this. If we lock D30, we can now drag the formula to the right and a 5% growth rate will be applied year over year. We can copy down this formula as well, and expenses will show a 5% growth year over year. Let's move on to formatting tip 10, expanding the view of data in columns. Let's say you have data typed in a bunch of cells, but the columns are too narrow to show all the data, and you want to expand the size of the column, but you don't want to do it manually one at a time. If you select everything in the worksheet and then double click on the middle between two cells at the divider, it will expand the width of the cells to accommodate the full text of the cells. Let's try that for this worksheet. Let's move columns C and D closer together, which will hide some text. I can then select columns C and D and double click on the header divider to expand the cell's width. As you can see, this achieves our objective of ensuring that we can expand the cells to show the full text. However, now the width is too large, and that reminds me of the next tip, word wrapping. I'm going to wrap the text in column D by highlighting the column, shrinking the width to the desired amount, and then clicking the word wrap button. The next tip that we have is the spell checker. Yes, just like Microsoft Word, Microsoft Office within Excel also has a spell checker. Just click on the Review tab in the top ribbon and then click on Spelling. This will help you ensure that your workbook is free from spelling errors. Formatting tip number 13. Here we see highlighted two alignment buttons. One of them points to the left and the other one points to the right. The purpose of this is to indent a word left or right within a cell. This can actually be used for formatting purposes when you want something to appear as an indentation, for example, a subcategory. It's a useful alternative to using spaces within a cell. The issue with using spaces in a cell is that it may mess up your formula. For instance, if you try to use the VLOOKUP formula on a text which contains spaces and look that up to a different set of data which doesn't have spaces in its cells, it'll probably return an error. So for that reason, I prefer to use the alignment button in Excel if I want to indent something and not put spaces at the front of it. That just completely throws off the context of the cell, and now the cell isn't a specific word, it's actually a bunch of spaces and a word, which becomes difficult to reference. An example is shown on screen here. In row 69, I use the indentation alignment button to move text to the right. In the cell below it, however, I use spaces. Then, in cells E69 and E70, I wrote a formula asking Excel to return the result true if it finds the words subscriptions or usage in the cells C69 and C70. It finds it for subscriptions but not for usage because I placed spaces in the usage cell. Therefore, this example proves that it's not always advantageous to use spaces at the beginning of a cell because it may throw off your formula. An alternative to this, of course, is just to use the indentation function to still achieve the desired presentation of the cell. Let's move on to formatting tip number 14 for flash fill. Flash fill is an autofill function built into Excel which recognizes patterns and tries to help you populate it. For instance, in column C, I have 5 email addresses which are structured as first name, last name, @gmail.com. Let's say we are tasked with inputting the first name and last name in the cell to the right of it. We can start with the first cell and type Chris Laza. Then let's move down to the next item, Mark Liaison. When we do this, Excel recognizes that we are trying to create a separate parallel list of names and attempts to autofill the rest of the list for us, which is very helpful and will save us time. Another formatting tip that I'd like to mention is that if you're preparing a worksheet to be presented for an important stakeholder, you should give it headers with some style. For example, you can make the top header have a color fill and use white text like I've done here. In this presentation on the screen here, I've also inserted a white line between the two headers, which gives it some nice division. Formatting tip number 16 mentions that it might be a good idea to have a dedicated tab in a workbook, specifically for outlining instructions on how to update your workbook. Let's say you're sending your workbook off to someone and they'll either want to understand how you updated your workbook or they'll want to know how to update it going forward. I often find the best way to describe this and document this is by creating a standalone worksheet within the workbook, which discusses step-by-step procedures for how one would update the workbook, the sources of data used to update it, and other important information. Similarly, if you're building a financial model, it's worthwhile to have an assumptions tab outlining the key assumptions that were used in the financial model. Even better, if possible, you should make it so that the assumptions can be modified on the assumptions tab, and if modified, it'll update the rest of the workbook. Formatting tip number 18 is in regards to placing dates along the top columns and summarizing data into fiscal quarters and years. I find the best way to organize data is to show the most recent data on the right side, as people typically want to read from left to right. In the example shown on screen here, I show January, February, and March results, and then I summarize the data with a quarterly view by putting that quarterly view to the right of March. Finally, the last formatting tip that I wanted to touch on is highlighting. As someone who has reviewed multiple workbooks, I can say that it's frustrating to review a workbook that is filled with multiple highlights that looks like a Christmas tree and not knowing where to look or what any of it means. It's important to limit the amount of highlights that you use in a workbook. If you do happen to use highlights, make sure that you have a legend somewhere in your workbook that indicates what all the highlights mean. Furthermore, if you're building a financial model, consider having all input variables filled with a specific color, like blue. That way the user will know that if they change the cells, or the contents of a cell rather, that's blue, it will vary the results of the financial model because it's an input cell and it has dependencies. I also like to use a yellow highlight when there are cells which contain issues or require further investigation. Another common one is red, but I think it's just important to have some sort of legend or consistency throughout your workbook with respect to the colors of highlights that you're using. Hey guys, thanks for watching this lesson. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, I'd really appreciate a like and subscribe from you. And if you want to learn more about Microsoft Excel, check out these videos above. And don't forget to check out our website, commercecurve.com, where we have lots of in-depth finance and accounting courses available with full training workbooks. All of our courses come with complete workbooks of lessons, examples, pre-built financial models, and training video. Hope to see you there.